Coming up, ANC in the Western Cape holds its 9th provincial conference at the Cape Town International Convention Centre. Chief Justice Raymond Zondo's critical remarks about Parliament's inability to stop state capture draw mixed reaction from parties in Parliament. And the United States Navy reveals it detected what might have been the implosion of the Titan submersible. A very good afternoon. If you've just joined us, we're coming to you live from our studios in Johannesburg. Welcome to Week in Review, the program where we review some of the biggest stories to come out of the week. I'm your host, Mfundo Mabalani. Now, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has warned of inevitable punishment for those he described as dividing the Russian society. President Putin was responding to a civil war threat by Yevgeny Prigozhin, that's the head of the Russian military contractor Wagner Group. Now, earlier on, Russia issued an order to arrest the group's leader for inciting civil conflict following his calls for rebellion against the country's defense minister. The group was based in Ukraine, fighting on behalf of Russia. Now, speaking through an interpreter, Putin says a counter-terrorism regime is now in place in the capital, Moscow, and several other regions.
Обращаюсь к гражданам России.
We won't let it repeat. We will protect our own people and statehood from any threats, including treason from the inside. What we are facing now is treason. Unreasonable ambitions and personal interests lead to treachery, state treason and betrayal of our own people, and the common cause which Wagner fighters and commanders fought for along and died alongside with our own units and brigades.
Russian President Vladimir Putin calls for unity as he describes the actions of the Wagner mercenary group chief Yevgeny Prigozhin as treason and a stab in the back. He said that the Russian law enforcement agencies have all been tasked with neutralizing anyone who has been involved into plotting and perpetrating this armed rebellion. He also has praised the work of the Wagner fighters who have been involved into the military activities in the area of the so-called special military operation, into what has been described in Moscow as liberation of Solidar and Bakhmut. The Russian president said that he would do everything to protect Russia and that the Russian armed forces have been given the necessary orders. At the same time, we have seen the Russian lawmakers calling for unity behind the Russian president. So the understanding in Russia, at least in the top echelons of the Russian authorities, is that it is not the right time for a rift within Russia. Russian president has also called on the society to stay united. He said that Russia was waging an existential fight with the Western countries, and certainly the rift within the Russian society was an unacceptable reality. He also has stressed that he would do everything to defend the country and to defend the Russian constitution. He said he would not allow a civil war in Russia. But at the same time, he noted that the situation in Russia's Rostov-on-Don has remained tough. This is where the head of Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, said his fighters have under their control all of the military sites, including the airfields, as well as the headquarters of Russia's southern military district. We also understand that the counter-terrorist operations regime has been introduced in a number of Russian regions, including in Moscow, the capital, as well as in Moscow region. So far, the situation in the streets of the capital remains stable. All the functions of the city are being implemented in full. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin said everything is working properly. The airports are still functioning, but certainly the situation is developing very rapidly, and we are expecting more developments to that. But the Russian authorities have been taking unprecedented measures to beef up security and to prevent what they call possible acts of terrorism. Dasha Cherneshova in Moscow, SABC News.
All right, let's shift our eyes to politics in the country. ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula says in as much as they respect the courts and the independence of the judiciary, he feels the court erred in its judgment, forcing them to furnish the DA with the minutes of their cadre deployment committee. Judge Wagner dismissed with cost the ANC's case and its appeal, saying no court will come to a different conclusion, but the governing party has since petitioned the Supreme Court of Appeal. Mbalula says they will defend their policy.
Our view is that Judge Willem Wagner has erred in his application of law, and we are therefore confident that a higher court might come to a different conclusion on the matter. The ANC will use available legal avenues and recourse to the courts to preserve its information, which is the property of the ANC, to the exclusion of any other party. The ANC reiterates its respect of the outcomes of the courts and their independence, including due process of the law.
Eastern Cape Premier Oscar Mabuyane says while he awaits the second part of his application to have the Special Investigating Unit probe into him declared unlawful, he will now challenge his exclusion and deregistration from the Fort Hare University. Now, earlier, the Eastern Cape High Court in Bishu interdicted the SIU from continuing its investigation into Mabuyane regarding the maladministration and impropriety allegations over the award of degrees at Fort Hare.
The first step of a two-part application, done and dusted, with Eastern Cape Premier Oscar Mabuyane emerging victorious. He said in the application the investigation is an abuse of power and was done to embarrass him. Mabuyane said the SIU investigation is outside the scope of the proclamation.
In the circumstances, I grant the following order. The Special Investigating Unit is interdicted from enforcing Proclamation 84 of 2022, published in the Government Gazette number 47199 on 5 August 2022, insofar as the SIU has taken steps or intends to take steps that are directed at the applicant, pending the determination of Part B. Each party is to bear its own costs. I hand down President.
Mabuyane is now taking further legal steps against the University of Fort Hare.
To challenge my deregistration, to challenge the so-called forensic report which Fort Hare has used now, which is a basis of SIU investigating me. Without doing anything, they just take what Fort Hare has given them, wrong as it is, without even looking at it. They go and mislead the president about it. So it can't be right.
Mabuyane says the matter of abuse of power must be addressed.
I had to pick up a fight on this one and fight for my actual rights. There are a lot of students who are being victimized in that university every day. This serious abuse of power, abuse of authority by the Vice Chancellor in that university. So I had to go all out just to fight for my integrity. I've got my integrity. Fort Hare is my alma mater. I studied at Fort Hare like any other student.
The SIU and the University of Fort Hare is still studying the judgment. The university says it remains committed to root out maladministration and fraud within the institution. Abongile Yankees, SABC News, Bisho.
All right, now still on that story, Higher Education, Science and Innovation Minister Blade Nzimande says the SIU should stick to investigating what is in the President's proclamation and not follow the route of trying to solve illegality at the University of Fort Hare. The minister was addressing the media in East London yesterday. That's following a closed engagement with Fort Hare stakeholders. The meeting was meant to address some of the university's governance issues and strengthening cooperation among the university's constituencies.
This meeting is a response to calls for the minister to intervene in the university challenges. Among the issues discussed is the instability in governance and the need for an appointment of an independent investigator to further probe allegations of academic fraud at the institution.
The SIU must stick to the proclamation when investigate. SIU can't be given. I've raised this, by the way, with Mr. Mtibi, directly when we were meeting with him. I said, I'm worried that sometimes the SIU seems to be given a particular proclamation, then it goes all over the place. I raised this with him, he can tell you. The court seems to be reinforcing that. Because you can't fight illegality with illegality, which is the matter I was raising, by the way, at Fort Hare, here at Fort Hare, because people say lots of things are being done illegally in the name of fighting corruption. You can't do that. If you are fighting corruption, you must do it legally. Can't fight illegality with illegality. We are not the apartheid regime here.
Meanwhile, the University Vice-Chancellor has refuted claims that he's out to persecute Eastern Cape Premier Oscar Mabuyane.
You know, on a normal day, I wouldn't want to be discussing the Premier. He's taken a decision to take matters to court, and that's his prerogative. The Vice-Chancellor targeting him, that is absolutely untrue. The Vice-Chancellor doesn't decide on academic matters. The decisions on academic matters are made by the Senate. A structure of the university, that's the kind of the apex structure that decides on academic matters. And his matter would have been discussed there, I imagine, not by the Vice-Chancellor. I'm sorry, he got it completely wrong right there.
The Vice-Chancellor says the concerns about the deteriorating image of the university are premature, as these are just casualties of reinforcing law and order at the institution. Sidima Mfegu, SABC News, East London.
Now, 3 more people are expected to be arrested in connection with the escape of murderer and rapist Thabo Bester. Prosecutor Sello Matloko has told the Bloemfontein Magistrate Court that police are finalizing cell phone data and bank statements. 8 people have been arrested to date for helping Bester escape from the Mangaung prison in May last year. The case has been postponed to the 8th of August.
It seems as if Thabo Bester cannot keep a lawyer. His legal representatives, Advocate Jeremiah Pela and instructing attorney Cyril Zondo, recused themselves, leaving Bester once again where he started off. Pela and Ndo did not cite their reasons for dropping Bester. In May, Bester's first attorney, Ryan Ishmael, also recused himself. Bester confirmed that Kabelo Matie will represent him going forward.
We request to bring an application for recusal on this matter. Myself and the instructing attorney, Mr. Ndo. We had a discussion with our client, Mr. Thabo Bester, and we came to amicable agreement that there won't be further instructions from today for me and Mr. Ndo. So based on that, Your Worship, we do not have further instructions to proceed with this matter. And if the court is inclined, it is our humble request for the court to accept our application to be recused.
Accused number 9, Zanda Moyo, who is the latest person to be arrested, abandoned his bail application. His legal representative, Bonolo Tebe, confirmed that Moyo has no pending case but could not confirm if he has previous convictions. The National Prosecuting Authority has reiterated that more arrests are imminent.
Like we said in the previous appearances, there is an investigative process underway, and once there is investigations underway, we cannot rule out the possibility of more people being arrested or any charges or more charges being added against any of the accused. So we are hoping, we are saying that we are hoping that come the 8th of August we'll have an idea as to how many accused are going to be arrested, if there's going to be an arrest, and how far the investigations are going to be.
The family of Katleho Bering, whose body was found charred in Thabo Bester's jail cell, says it is optimistic that justice is being served.
You know, it is encouraging to see to it that, behind the scenes, the investigation is still going and they are working hard. It gives us hope. Because yes, we know that more arrests still has to be made, but coming from them, it gives us hope that they are on the right track.
Meanwhile, Magistrate Mohlolo Khabisi declined accused number 2 Zolile Sekeleni's application not to attend the next court proceedings. Thabo Bester's new lawyer requested for his client to appear in person on the next date, and the prosecution had no objection. Kamkhelo Siekwi, SABC News, Bloemfontein.
All right, we're now joined by legal analyst Mpumelelo Zigalala just to unpack some of the biggest stories coming out of our courts this past week. Mpumelelo, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, it's been a very busy week in our courts, from Thabo Bester to Oscar Mabuyane, and now the ANC's petitioning of the Supreme Court of Appeal. But let's start with Premier Mabuyane's interdict. The judge basically said the SIU was now attempting to go beyond the scope of the proclamation by looking at the master's program, essentially misconstruing its authority. What did you make of that judgment?
But there are two ways of looking at it. The narrow interpretation of what is there would be, as the SIU are giving a shopping list, anything that you add in addition to the shopping list must be excluded. That's the narrow interpretation. The wider one is then to say, well, are we as the SIU, a law enforcement agency, who are there or charged to investigate corruption, in the course of investigating the honours degree, for example, not going in a compliance manner, if we then discover information that implicates that some individuals have received other degrees, for example, your undergraduate, your PhD, your even your master's degree, then are we supposed to turn a blind eye and not look into those? Or are we supposed to engage in procedures in which we collect and prevent that information that you've collected, which is going to be vital when we go to court at a later stage so that you are able to come back with a conviction? Or try other means in which to try and make sure that the legality of the investigation that has been done is proper. So that is what I think is going to be argued more on part B of this particular application, in terms of saying what is the SIU supposed to do in this type of things? Turn a blind eye or continue that investigation but find ways of correcting it. In fact, during the judgment, the judge was clear in terms of saying, well, you could go back to the president.
Yes.
Say to him, can you please submit those particular, the shopping list that you've given us, to make sure that it includes any other thing? Maybe as a moving forward, just to have a one-liner to say any other illegality that is taking place, you have the right to investigate it. Those can be perceived as wide powers. However, I think it is needed, because you must remember, when you are writing this proclamation at the start of the investigation, you don't know what you are going to find. There may be other things and other individuals which may be implicated. And if you've closed the door and made it such a closed shopping list, then it makes it difficult for you to fight corruption. The ultimate end of any law enforcement agency is to bring those that have broken the law or allegedly broken the law to book, and so that they're able to answer in our courts. So if they're not going to be able to do that, then it defeats the whole purpose of why we would even have the SIU, the whole purpose of why we would even have proclamations, just because we have a narrow interpretation of what the law actually says.
But the door is not essentially closed. They're not without remedy in this instance, because the president had stated, and you're speaking about that as well, even in the judgment. In the president's answering affidavit, he stated that in terms of Section 4 of the SIU Act, he has the powers to amend the proclamation. So in this instance, one would say they are not without remedy. Am I correct?
Correctly so, but I think it's a question of time, because once you do this investigation, the quality and the quantity of the evidence that you are collecting also depends on time. If you have evidence which of lesser quality, lesser quantity, then it makes a conviction or coming back with a conviction at a later stage very difficult. When you go to court on a criminal basis, you must be able to prove or guilty beyond reasonable doubt that the individual who's sitting in that particular accused box is the one that has committed this crime. And if you cannot preserve that information in which you've collected, then it makes it very difficult for one to be able to do that. So there are various options which are available to the president and also to the university. They can conduct their own investigation. In fact, they can go tomorrow to a local SABC and say, this is the information that we have. Can you please handle it for us? Conduct further investigation on this. Or they can go to the president and say to the president, amend the processes that are there, extend or include all qualifications which are or that we are rendering as the Fort Hare University, and that can be cured. They can continue with the investigation and even use the information that they've already received.
Then to another big legal matter this week, the ANC's cadre deployment case. They've indicated they'll be petitioning the SCA after their application for leave to appeal was dismissed. What are the prospects of success here?
I think they're quite high. Remember, what you are dealing with is the application of the Promotion of Access to Information Act to political parties. When it comes to certain individuals, government departments, it has been easy in terms of interpreting where do we start and where do we end. Now, when it comes to political parties, yes, we understand the role, especially of the ruling party, the role in which one would be playing within the society, the impact in the decisions which are taking place within political party then have an impact on us as the members of the society. But the question then is, where do we draw the line in terms of the internal discussions and strategies and plots which are taking place, and manner in which they use to be able to make sure that they're able to govern in the way in which they are governing now? To me, the SCA I think it's going to say, let's listen to what you have got to say. But the ultimate end will be the Constitutional Court. This is a constitutional matter. You need finality in this type of matter so that you have a once and for all rule interpretation of the principles and also the sections of the Act that are stated there to say, as members of the public, what do we have access to and what do we not have access to. Another way of looking at it is as if the Democratic Alliance is saying to the ANC, can you please tell us your unique selling points and strategies as to how exactly you are supposed or you are governing the country. Let's look into those, provide them to us because you're a political party which is out there in the public. But for me, the most concern is this one. The person who presses the green button or signs a letter of appointment either of a minister or HOD, a premier or anyone who's in the public service, is someone who has been appointed as per the Act or as per the applicable legislative provision. So why don't you make that particular access or request information on how, Mr. President, did you appoint this minister to the president and not to the political party? They are the ones who are forced by the Constitution to make sure that whatever decisions in which they take meets three basic requirements. Firstly, legality. Secondly, rationality. And the other one, procedural fairness. So if you're going to have the problem with rationality, go and ask the person that has made that particular appointment. If you go to a political party, you may not find the results that you are looking for because the ANC may submit and say, you know, that when the new administration started, we have recommended the following names for ministers. However, they were not appointed. The president used his own prerogative because this is rights as a constitution. So it's not going to assist you in terms of the information and what has been there. But what you are going to get is intimate conversations and meetings and strategies of a political party being requested by another political party, which is not going to assist in holding anyone accountable when there are applicable legislative provisions in which they could be utilized. That is the exact question in which I believe the Constitutional Court should be able to answer in terms of saying, where do we draw the line? Where do we stop the boundaries? And what happens beyond that in terms of protecting even the privacy of the African National Congress?
Mpumelelo, very interesting case. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you very much for your analysis as always. That's legal expert Mpumelelo Zikalala speaking to us. More news on the other side. Do stay with us. Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, Chief Justice Raymond Zondo's critical remarks about Parliament's inability to stop state capture have drawn mixed reactions from parties in Parliament. While the remarks have been criticized by Parliament and the ANC, some opposition parties came to Zondo's defense. Zondo criticized Parliament while addressing the Human Science Research Council's colloquium on Thursday, which marked a year since he handed over the final installment of the state capture report to President Cyril Ramaphosa.
These are the remarks which set tongues wagging in Parliament.
If another group of people were to do exactly what the Guptas did to pursue state capture, if another group were to do the same, Parliament would still not be able to stop it.
Parliament hit back at Zondo, accusing him of breaching the separation of powers.
It is not the place of the Chief Justice to make such public remarks unless and until he is required to adjudicate on a matter with impartiality.
The ANC has also closed the ranks with Parliament, saying the Chief Justice cannot tell the lawmakers what to do.
He has overreached in terms of trying to tell Parliament what to do in a very attacking manner. Parliament has its own internal arrangement and procedures on how to implement findings. It is unfortunate that he attacked Parliament the way he has done. With due respect to him, we are a constitutional country and therefore we respect Constitution. We can't tell him how to handle matters of justice.
However, some opposition parties have defended Zondo.
We could not agree with him more. We have long been calling for Parliament to implement the recommendations that are contained in the state capture report, a report that cost the taxpayer over R1 billion. But the ANC in Parliament has been dead set on blocking the recommendations that are contained in this report.
Chief Justice Zondo is correct when he says that Parliament is still failing to do effective oversight over the executive and to prevent a repetition of state capture. The majority of Parliament still does not take the oversight function serious and does not effectively provide oversight to prevent corruption.
There is no action from Parliament to implement the Zondo Commission recommendations because the former president, Jacob Zuma, the sitting president, Cyril Ramaphosa, senior cabinet ministers and deputy ministers are fingered and implicated in the report. The majority of members of parliament are from the ANC. Their mandate is to defend and protect their leaders.
The EFF has also accused Parliament of not doing its job.
They've shown this when they blocked the inquiry into corruption at ESCOM. They've shown this when they blocked the inquiry into the criminal activities of money laundering that happened in relation to Phala Farm on the basis that there's a judicial process underway, only for that judicial process to be abandoned because Parliament voted against establishing a committee of inquiry into Phala Farm.
The IFP says Zondo has the right to express his views on the work he did as the chairperson of the State Capture Commission.
Whilst we believe that one needs to recognize the separation of powers, I don't think it is out of order that the Chief Justice who headed this commission could express his view in terms of the matter not proceeding as swiftly as he or the commission would have expected.
It's unclear how Zondo's latest remarks will affect relations among the three arms of the state: the judiciary, which he leads, the executive, which is led by the president, and parliament. Lula Mamatya, SABC News, Parliament.
All right, for more on this and other stories making headlines this week, we're joined by Asanda Nwasheng. She's a political analyst. Asanda, good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekend Review. Now, the Chief Justice's address this week seems to have sparked somewhat of a debate on several fronts, actually. Parliament being among those who reacted, raising the separation of powers doctrine, almost suggesting that the Chief Justice may have encroached on the domain of the legislature or executive here. What did you make of his address as a start?
Well, I think that, people misunderstand what separation of powers is. So separation of powers stands or basically says that you have the executive, then you have the legislature, and you have the judiciary. And the job of the executive and the legislature and the judiciary are separate from each other. And the three arms of government have to be in communication with each other and have to play the role of ensuring that there are checks and balances and that each arm is held accountable. So there's two issues when it comes to South Africa. The first issue is that in some countries where there is separation of power, you do not have people who belong to both the legislature and the executive. So in South Africa, you have people who belong to both the executive and the legislature, which means you have people sitting across the two arms of government. And then what has been good so far, though, is that the judiciary has and is impartial. However, people think that separation of powers means the judiciary cannot make pronouncements or deliver opinions or thoughts on the work of the executive and the legislature, whereas that is exactly the job of the judiciary. Its job is to make sure that the laws that are being passed are sound and actually make sense when it comes to the Constitution and how the Constitution is read or can be read. And also it is to make sure that justice takes place. Mm-hmm. And so when you have a judge like Judge Zondo, who led the Zondo Commission into state capture, seeing that a year later, the pronouncements that he made, the recommendations that he made haven't been followed to the extent that he desired when he laid down those recommendations, he has every right to come back and say, remember, guys, we have this responsibility of doing this as per the commission that you hired me to lead. And also as the Chief Justice, he has a responsibility to ensure that where the legislature has failed and where the executive has failed, he has to call it out, particularly as somebody who was involved in that particular commission. So where people make the mistake and get confused is that they think because the pronouncements he's making, because the most affected political party happens to be the governing party, because it has the most implicated members, they see it as an attack on the ANC, which is not true. It is not an attack on the ANC. If it was that South Africa was run by 4 political parties and those 4 political parties were implicated in state capture, Zondo would have exactly the same right to talk about those 4 political parties and the implications that them and their governance and their kind of their shenanigans essentially have, how they have impacted South Africa. And so he is actually executing his very role of holding the judiciary, of holding the legislative sector of government to account, and also holding the executive arm into account. And in fact, if he didn't speak out as he has, he would be failing in his job. This is precisely what he is being paid to do. This is precisely what he has been entrusted with.
Asanda, I don't want his very important statements to be lost in all the criticism, but I just want to get your views on another concern that was raised by another grouping in society, where they said in most instances for them they find it undesirable that a judicial officer would express himself or herself on any public platform. What they have seen, or what has been a long-standing principle, is that judges express themselves through their judgments and findings. What do you make of that?
I think that that's more a sense of a preference rather than, something that's put down in law. So just because your predecessors used to conduct themselves in a specific way, it doesn't mean that, the incumbent has to basically conduct themselves in the same way. As I've said, it is literally the job of Judge Zondo as, the #1 judge essentially in the country, the Chief Justice. It is his job to ensure that where justice is not being meted out, where people are not receiving the justice that they deserve, that he calls it out. Where there are things that are unconstitutional, where the legislature is failing, it is his job to call it out. And so to expect him to wait until there is another judgment before he makes his pronouncement is actually the reason why we keep falling into the situations that we fall in, because the very people who have been entrusted with power are too busy being scared. You must remember that the reason why we have separation of powers is because no one arm of government is supposed to be all powerful. The judiciary is just as powerful as the legislature, which is just as powerful as the executive. And the 3 arms of government are meant to work together such that the power of the president is not more and should never be more than the power of the judge. From a perspective of separation of powers, the 3 arms of government are supposed to be equally powerful and are supposed to be equally challenging of each other and need to equally check and balance each other. You heard, I think it was Pemima Jodina, who stated it correctly and said, as per the separation of power principle, we cannot pronounce on what the judiciary is or isn't supposed to do. That means they understand and they are following the letter of the law. And I think, again, I want to highlight that what confuses people is that we have a governing party that has had a majority and abused, unfortunately, that majority in parliament to ensure that only party political stances are put forward and only stances that are for the benefit of the ANC rather than for the benefit of South Africans go ahead. And so because of that, we now want to criticize Zondo and see him as an ANC critic rather than this is a man doing his job, which is to critique, which is to have checks and balances, and which is to challenge the president, the executive, and all members of parliament as part of the legislature and the executive. If he doesn't do this, he is failing. And so we can have conversations about when, conversations about how, and conversations about the extent to which he can critique. But we cannot do this thing where we say he doesn't have a right to be giving these opinions, particularly in a case where he is pronouncing on a commission that he led a year ago. And it is responsibility to say it's been a year. And we need to have this conversation.
Let's now delve into some of those statements or opinions as you put them. He stated that he doesn't believe Parliament is in a better position now than under the Zuma administration to stop attempts to capture the state. Do you believe that the tendencies of some to frustrate efforts to hold the executive accountable have been done away with, or it's very much still happening?
I agree with him. I think that we haven't made enough changes from a legislative perspective to ensure that the executive can be held account. We saw the ways in which Jacob Zuma abused his power, and to a certain extent there have been questions around the ways in which the Phala issue was handled and the ways in which there was a response to the independent commission that was done on Phala, which was kind of pushed forward by Parliament.
Yes,
and so
Section 89.
there needs to be constantly, there constantly needs to be questions around this. And we've seen the controversy around what's happening to the public protector and the inquiry into the public protector. All of these things are showcasing that our institutions are weak where they are supposed to be strong. And so we shouldn't be having a situation where we are questioning the very values and the potential for bribery and corruption of members of parliament. They should be beyond reproach. But we live in a country where we are so used to corruption and bribery that we don't even bat an eyelid or see that what we are actually dealing with at this point is the institutional quality and the inability of our institutions to withstand scrutiny and to withstand, any kind of challenge. And what we are going to have to see in future is potential changes to the constitution to start to actually deal with the country that we have rather than the ideal country that we want. And so if you think about how we used to think about our constitution and presidential powers before Jacob Zuma came and showed us flames, we are going to have to rethink the ways in which the separation of powers is constituted, the ways in which constitutional powers of the president work, and all of those things with the understanding that we have now had 30 years of
now his
one political
suggestions
party
there.
being in power.
Now, the Chief Justice suggestion there is, of course, electoral reforms that he spoke about, but then he also spoke of that anti-corruption or anti-state capture standing commission that he's calling for, which would essentially be like similar to his commission to a certain extent, where evidence is laid in the open. But he says what would be a benefit there is that it would lead to strong public opinions, which would then force Parliament to act on certain issues. Is this honestly workable, though?
I think so. I 100% agree with him, because part of why we are stuck when it comes to action on state capture is because the very people who are implicated are the ones who are needed to make the action. And so members of the executive are implicated in state capture, are mentioned in state capture, and they are still sitting in their positions with nothing having happened to them. And they are now the very same people as members of the executive and as members of the legislature being expected to do something about the very corruption they're implicated in. It's not going to happen. And so you do need a separate entity that has neutrality, that is not going to be clouded by the fact that I might get into trouble or I might actually be sending my own colleagues to the gallows.
Is that not essentially replicating what Parliament would be doing?
It's not replicating Parliament. And so in an ideal world, when, the separation of powers was implemented or thought about as a political principle, that made sense. We were supposed to have people in Parliament who are beyond reproach. We are supposed to have people who understand separation of powers and who are ethical, but we don't. So we can't live in a world where we have laws based on a fake reality. We have to have laws based on this reality, that is the South Africa that we have, that has an institutionally corrupt political party at the helm. When you have an institutionally corrupt political party at the helm. You cannot continue to pretend like you don't know this and continue to implement laws on the basis or a foundation that requires, ethical leadership. So we have a lack of ethical leadership. We have a lack of, moral, moral quality essentially in our leadership. And because of this, we are constantly having to replicate institutions. Yes, constantly having to rethink how we can hold people accountable because this is the reality of what we live in. And we are going to continue to see corruption. We are going to continue to live in this dire state if we don't act on the basis of what we have rather than what we wish we had or what an ideal situation looks like. And I also want to remind people that, political institutions, political theories, and political structures change all the time because they have to respond to the reality of the day. And so just because separation of powers as initially instituted was implemented and instituted in a particular way, it doesn't mean it always has to be that way. It is up to the people to inform the ways that it's meant to be. That's why Zondo spoke of electoral reform and that electoral reform. Yes, that's why he spoke about electoral reform. And now we are in a situation where we are talking about electoral reform because guess what? The constitution is not cast in stone because human beings change and things change. And you have to ensure that your political systems respond to the changes that are happening rather than are these beautiful, institutions and monuments that we look to and refer to, but they actually do nothing for us in the real world and in our everyday lives.
Asanda, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That was Asanda Ngwasheng giving us some insights there on stories that made headlines this week on the political front. To this story now, Parliament passed 2 critical pieces of proposed laws this week before MPs left for their constituency oversight. The Eskom Debt Relief Bill aims to curb the power utilities spiralling debt, and the Appropriation Bill, which will allow the National Revenue Fund to pay for government activities. But some opposition parties are critical of the proposed laws.
The passage of the Appropriation Bill by Parliament paves the way for government to spend the budget that was tabled by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana in February. The budget allocates about 74% to transfers and subsidies. The transfers are to provinces, municipalities, public corporations, and the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, amongst others. However, some opposition parties rejected the presidency's budget vote, which is part of the appropriation bill.
We also reject the budget of the president, who has failed to decisively stabilize and revitalize state-owned entities in South Africa. Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa has failed to lead South Africa in all respects. And as the EFF, we refuse to legitimize his regime of corruption, anti-constitutionalism, and rolling electricity blackouts.
The Zondo Commission report that cost taxpayers 1 billion rand had 1,438 people implicated. But here we are 1 year later and not one substantial arrest has been made. Pala and the non-alignment on the Russia and Ukraine war seems destined to re-establish South Africa's pariah status.
The EFF and DA also rejected Parliament's budget vote.
We reject the budget of Parliament, which has been unable to fulfill its primary responsibility of holding Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa accountable and instead chooses to protect him for the role which he continues to play in destroying South Africa.
I oppose this budget because Parliament requested 4.3 billion rand to do its job properly and received 3.8 billion rand, some 500 million rand shy of what it needs. I reject this budget because it effectively rejects the recommendations of the Zondo Commission because no work is being done.
But the ANC defended the work of Parliament.
We are confident that the processes that is already underway to restore the Parliament will be executed efficiently. As the ANC, we welcome the fact that Parliament continue to obtain a clean audit, which represents which represent good governance.
The NCOP also approved the Eskom Debt Relief Bill, which has already been passed by the National Assembly. The bill aims to power up Eskom with 254 billion rand over the next 3 financial years. The ANC defended the bailout, saying any debt default by Eskom could create a sovereign debt crisis. Some opposition parties are concerned about SOEs being heavily dependent on the national fiscus.
Corruption and mismanagement is at the core of Eskom's financial problems. The elimination thereof, as well as the recovery of stolen funds, transparency, accountability, and a change in the culture of non-payment should be pursued by Eskom.
The EFF said while it supported the recapitalization of Eskom, it says the money should be used to complete outstanding work at power stations and for the generation of additional capacity.
The bill before this House seeks to do the opposite. We want to warn all South Africans in this House today that this bill is not going to solve any problem. If anything, it will only fast-track the national grid collapse.
On the health front, the much-awaited National Health Insurance Bill is now before the NCOP, this after being passed by the National Assembly. Health authorities have urged the NCOP to endorse it.
We ask that the committee focus on the very vulnerable individuals who are the majority of people in our society who need this care, and rather than look at the narrow interests of those who fear losing some of, not even all, but some of the super profits and privileges which they're currently enjoying.
The NHI proposes the creation of a fund which will allow for a single purchaser and payer of health services. Authorities have considered that this has generated a lot of criticism.
We do know that the funders are anxious, and we have seen the negative comments in the media space from the funders. And that's a very obvious why they are more negative than the providers.
The fund will cover South African citizens, including permanent residents, refugees, inmates, as well as specific categories of foreign nationals. Health authorities hope the NHI will be fully implemented by 2029. That's if it's not delayed by legal challenges. Ulelani Philip, SABC News, Parliament.
Consumer inflation has dropped to a 13-month low. It slowed for a second consecutive month to 6.3% in May. That's down from 6.8% in April. While the reading remains above the Reserve Bank's target range of 3 to 6%, it's the lowest since April of 2022, when the rate was 5.9%.
The main contributors to the 6.3% annual inflation rate were food and non-alcoholic beverages, transport and housing and utilities. While food price increases remain high, the pace has slowed in May when compared to April. Most food and non-alcoholic beverage categories recorded lower annual inflation, with the exception of sugar and sweets and desserts. Food inflation was lower at 11.8% when compared to the April reading of 13.9%. Transport inflation recorded an increase of 7%. In May, prices of both grades of petrol increased by 37 cents per litre, while diesel went down by 74 cents per litre.
We generally think there's an ongoing pass-through of cost pressures from the producer, from the retailers. You would remember retailers that say it's costing them a lot to run generators to keep foods cold. So you're seeing that filtering still in the numbers, and that's why you still have monthly pressure on food inflation. We were very, very concerned that during the winter months we might see an escalation in load shedding to say stage 8, and that would be something new for producers, retailers to deal with, and that would drive food inflation even higher. So it has been positive that in June specifically, we haven't yet seen that escalation in load shedding, and hopefully that supports a slowdown in food inflation, a stronger slowdown in food inflation going forward.
The slowing inflation could give the Reserve Bank room to slow the pace of the interest rate hikes or even pause them.
interest rates probably won't go down pretty soon, but because of that lower inflation number, plus also the expectation of lower food inflation and thus lower headline inflation over the next few months, in terms of my forecast, headline CPI inflation can be below 6% by June and below 5% by July, and around 4.5% for the rest of the year. So that means it's unlikely that the Reserve Bank can hike rates any further this year. So in terms of my forecast, looking at these numbers, what comes through the pipeline, etc., and the lagged effect of past rate increases on the economy, we've seen the last rate hike by the Reserve Bank in May.
The Reserve Bank expects inflation for this year to average 6.2%, slowing to 5.1% next year before reaching the midpoint of the target bracket in 2025. Gloria Sefakomosi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
All right, more news on the other side of this break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, the United States Navy has revealed that it detected what might have been the implosion of the Titan submersible as early as Sunday. At the time, the vessel lost communication capabilities with the mothership above it in the North Atlantic Ocean. Their top-secret underwater listening sensors designed to track hostile activities in the high seas picked up the sound of the catastrophic yet unconfirmed event in an area where the debris of Titan was discovered by a remotely operated vehicle on Thursday. Now, this information was later relayed by the U.S. Coast Guard leading the search and rescue efforts. Now, all 5 passengers aboard the vessel were lost after what has been described as a catastrophic implosion of the vessel.
In consultation with experts from within the Unified Command, the debris is consistent with the catastrophic loss of the pressure chamber. Upon this determination, we immediately notified the families.
The moment the world became aware that all hope of finding the 5 people aboard Titan alive had been lost, as an almost 5-day multinational search and rescue operation was now a recovery effort, after a field of debris from Titan was discovered about 500 meters off the bow of the Titanic wreckage near the ocean floor.
We're going to continue to investigate the site of the debris field. And then I know that there's also a lot of questions about how, why, and when did this happen. And so, those are questions that we will collect as much information as we can on now, while the governments are meeting and discussing, what an investigation of this nature of a casualty might look like.
The 5 passengers on board included UK billionaire Hamish Harding, Pakistani-born businessman Shahzada Dawood and his son Suleiman, French explorer Paul-Henri Nagoulet, and the CEO of Titan's operating company Stockton Rush, as questions abound about OceanGate safety standards given their late CEO's innovative approach, including the experimental use of carbon fiber to construct Titan's hull.
OceanGate shouldn't have been doing what it was doing. I think that's pretty clear. I wish I had been more vocal about that, but I think I was unaware that they weren't certified. Because I wasn't really studying it. I wasn't really interested. Stockton Rush asked me if I wanted to go out there and dive this season. I wasn't interested.
But OceanGate's co-founder gave a spirited defense of the company's commitment to safety.
Stockton was one of the most astute risk managers I'd ever met. He was very risk averse. He was very keenly aware of the risks of operating in a deep ocean environment. And he was very committed to safety. I believe that every innovation that he took, whether it was engineering or operations or even personnel-wise for us, was, at least in the early going and then after I left the company, was geared toward 2 goals. One is expanding humanity's ability to explore the deep oceans, and secondly, to do it as safely as possible.
James Cameron also criticized the expansive search effort that only grew as the days ticked by.
Search. 4 days of search. They're searching everywhere. They were running around with their hair on fire. The sub was right where it was. It was literally on the seafloor below its last known position, which is the first place you look in a search is the last known position. You don't go running around all over the landscape with planes and trains and automobiles searching, right? It was right where it was when it imploded, and I knew that's where they were going to find it.
Events that will spark a multitude of legal considerations once an investigation is complete. Legal experts argue that despite passengers signing waivers, OceanGate could still be held liable if evidence suggested any negligence in maintenance, crew training, or failure to implement safety precautions. Liability that will be heavily dependent on the evidence gathered in an investigation that largely finds itself at the bottom of the ocean floor. Shervin Briceby's SABC News, New York.
All right, and that's where I leave it for today. Hopefully the flu will be more forgiving on my voice tomorrow, but have a wonderful afternoon further. Goodbye.